For 30 years, I allowed my toxic sister to believe I was a pathetic, lonely failure. I quietly paid her massive debts. I endured her endless insults. And I stayed completely invisible to keep the peace. But when she cornered me at our father's funeral, smirking at my empty ring finger and loudly calling me a tragic spinster in front of the entire town, she had absolutely no idea she had just triggered her own complete ruin. Because the moment the heavy chapel doors swung open, 4 military honor guards marched in, followed by my fiercely protective, incredibly powerful husband. In a matter of seconds, my family's 30-year illusion was completely shattered. In this story, we are breaking down the ultimate truth. Sacrificing your own boundaries just to keep toxic family members comfortable is not love. It is self-destruction. If you have ever had to cut ties to save your own sanity, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and let me know, when did you finally stop paying for people who never respected you? The St. Jude Memorial Chapel smelled of polished oak and expensive lilies. The air inside was heavy. It was not just the natural weight of a funeral. It was the suffocating atmosphere of my family. I stood near the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. I deliberately kept my distance from the front pews. I wore my dark blue army dress uniform. The fabric was perfectly pressed. The brass buttons caught the dim light of the stained glass windows. On my shoulders, a single silver star rested quietly. I am a brigadier general in the United States Army. I did not wear this uniform today to intimidate anyone. I wore it for my father. Thomas Wright was a man of profound and quiet honor. He was the only person in this building who ever truly saw me. I wanted to bury him as the woman he raised. I refused to attend his memorial as the pathetic failure my mother and sister pretended I was. I watched them from across the room. My mother, Margaret, was holding court. She wore a black dress that was entirely too dramatic for a morning service. She dabbed her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She loved the attention. She loved the sympathy of the wealthy neighbors. Next to her was my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe wore a designer dress she absolutely could not afford. She looked like she was attending a gala rather than a funeral. They were performing. They always performed. Honor was a foreign language in our household. Everything was about appearances. Everything was about status. I took off my white uniform gloves. I slipped them into my pocket. I had taken off my wedding rings earlier to wash my hands in the restroom, and I left them in my coat pocket as well. I did not care to put them back on just yet. I just wanted a moment of peace. I wanted to look at my father's portrait near the altar. But peace was never an option when Chloe was in the room. She spotted me standing by the doors. She broke away from her group of gossiping friends. She glided down the center aisle. Her high heels clicked loudly against the stone floor. She stopped a few feet away from me. She looked me up and down. Her eyes scanned my uniform with absolute disdain. She did not know what the star meant. She did not care to know. Then, her eyes dropped to my left hand. She noticed the missing rings. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her face. Still alone. "Eleanor," she whispered. Her voice was dripping with fake pity. It was the same tone she used when we were children, still pushing paper at some sad little desk job. "Look at you, showing up in a costume." I did not blink. I did not look away. "You know," Chloe continued, leaning in closer, "Dad went to his grave crying over you. He was so upset about how pathetic your life turned out. You are over 40 years old. You do not even have a +1 to your own father's funeral. It is honestly just tragic." Decades ago, those words would have broken me. I would have shrunk down. I would have let her make me feel small so she could feel tall. But those days were over. I had spent years in therapy. I had commanded battalions in active war zones. The petty insults of a narcissistic sister meant absolutely nothing to me now. I looked her dead in the eye. I smiled. It was a calm, steady smile. "I am not alone, Chloe," I said quietly, "and I highly suggest you step back." Chloe laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound, but that laugh died instantly in her throat. The heavy oak doors of the chapel suddenly swung open behind me. The heavy thud echoed through the silent church. Every head in the room turned. The whispers completely stopped. 4 men in full military dress blues marched into the vestibule. Their movements were sharp and perfectly synchronized. They were the honor guard. And walking right behind them was my husband. Marcus is a federal prosecutor. He is tall, distinguished, and commands authority the second he walks into a room. He wore a dark, tailored suit. His expression was fiercely protective. But Marcus did not come here to rescue me. I did not need rescuing. He came here to stand behind me. He came to be my amplifier. He walked past the staring crowd. He walked past my mother, who had dropped her lace handkerchief. He walked past a pale, visibly shaking Chloe. He stopped right in front of me. He stood at perfect attention. He looked at me with deep pride. And then he saluted. "General Vance," Marcus said. His deep voice carried clearly across the silent, echoing chapel. "The honor guard is ready for your command." He dropped his salute. His stern face softened into a warm, loving smile. He reached into his pocket. "And, sweetheart," Marcus said gently, "you dropped your wedding rings in the car." He took my left hand. He carefully slid the diamond ring back onto my finger. The silence in the church was deafening. I looked over at Chloe. All the color had completely drained from her face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. She stared at the star on my shoulder. She stared at the federal prosecutor holding my hand. The illusion she had built for 30 years was shattering into a million pieces right before her eyes. Healing from a toxic family does not happen overnight. It is a long, brutal war of attrition. And I had won mine a long time ago, for years. My mother and my sister treated me like a bank. I was the older, responsible sister. I was the one who joined the military to pay for my own college education. I worked for everything I had. But whenever Chloe maxed out a credit card, my mother would call me. She would use the same manipulative script every single time. "Be a good sister, Eleanor," she would say. "Family helps family. Do not be so selfish." And for a long time, I actually paid. I covered Chloe's debts. I paid my mother's extravagant bills. I paid because I mistakenly thought that buying their comfort was the only way to earn their love. I thought if I just gave them enough, they would finally respect me. They would finally see me. But 10 years ago, I finally woke up. I was sitting in a therapist's office near the military base. I was a major by then. I commanded hundreds of troops. I made high-stakes decisions every single day. Yet, a 5-minute phone call with my mother could still make me feel like a helpless child. My therapist listened to my stories. She looked at me with deep empathy. Then she said a sentence that completely changed the trajectory of my life. "Eleanor, you are funding your own abuse. When do you stop paying?" That very day, the family ATM closed permanently. I wrote them a letter. I kept it professional, clear, and firm. I told them I loved them. But I would no longer finance a lifestyle of lies and entitlement. I demanded basic respect. Their reaction was predictable. They cut me out of their lives. They told the entire town that I was a selfish, lonely spinster who abandoned her poor family. Chloe quickly married David, a flashy businessman with a slick smile. They bought a house in a gated community. They played the role of the perfect high society family. I let them talk. Because while they were busy building a fake life for the neighbors, I was building a real one. I rose through the military ranks. I met Marcus. We fell in love and built a beautiful home. We built a marriage based on absolute equality, mutual respect, and unconditional support. I never hid my husband from my family. I just refused to cast him as a character in their toxic circus. My father was the only one who knew the truth. We spoke on the phone every Sunday. He knew about my promotions. He knew about Marcus, but he kept my secrets perfectly. He knew that my mother would try to destroy anything beautiful in my life. 2 days after the funeral, the illusion finally completely collapsed. We were sitting in my father's lawyer's office. The room was lined with heavy bookshelves. Chloe and David sat across the large mahogany table. They looked like a couple out of a luxury magazine. Chloe was wearing his expensive sunglasses indoors. David was wearing a custom suit and tapping a gold pen against the table. My mother sat next to them, looking incredibly smug. Before the lawyer could even speak, Chloe reached into her designer bag. She slammed a thick legal document onto the center of the table. Dad signed this last month, Chloe announced. Her voice was loud and full of arrogant confidence. It gives me full power of attorney over the entire estate. And it specifically states that Eleanor gets absolutely nothing. He wrote that it was because of her severe mental instability. My mother nodded eagerly. She did not even look at me. It is really for the best. Eleanor, you are all alone. You do not know how to handle real money. Chloe and David are business people. They know what to do with the estate. I did not panic. I did not stay stoic and quietly swallow the pain like I used to. I fought back. I calmly opened my leather briefcase. I pulled out a heavy stack of federal financial records. I placed them gently on the table. That is a fascinating document. Chloe, I said smoothly. I leaned forward. But it is a complete forgery. I know this for a fact. Because Dad legally transferred all of his assets into a federal blind trust 3 years ago. A trust managed by military regulators. I slid the real documents across the table. They were stamped with official federal seals. Chloe stared at them. Her smug expression vanished. Furthermore, I continued, I turned my gaze directly to David. His gold pen stopped tapping. I had my security team do a background check. Your logistics business went totally bankrupt 6 months ago. David, you have 3 defaulted mortgages on your house. You forged my father's signature to steal his estate and cover your massive, embarrassing debts. David started coughing. He tugged at his silk tie. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Chloe's jaw hit the floor. She looked at her husband in absolute horror. The fake high society life she had bragged about for years was nothing but smoke and mirrors. And I had just turned on the lights. The heavy silence in the mahogany-lined office was absolute. The air felt as though it had been entirely sucked out of the room. David stared at the federal financial documents I had just slid across the table, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. The expensive gold pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the polished wood beside him. Chloe looked as though she had been physically struck by an invisible force. Her oversized designer sunglasses, previously perched on her head like a crown of superiority, suddenly looked entirely ridiculous. She turned her head slowly toward her husband, her face completely drained of color, desperately searching for a denial that was clearly never going to come. The confident, arrogant smirk she had worn at the chapel just days earlier was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, undeniable panic of a cornered animal. Before David could stammer out a pathetic lie, Marcus stepped forward from the corner of the room where he had been quietly observing. He moved with the calm, predatory grace of a man who spent his life dismantling white-collar criminals in federal courtrooms. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his official federal prosecutor badge, placing it deliberately on top of the forged will Chloe had brought. The metallic clink echoed sharply in the quiet office. Marcus looked down at David with eyes as cold as ice. I highly advise you to remain silent, David, Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded instant obedience. Unless, of course, you would like to officially discuss the fraudulent legal documents you just attempted to submit to this estate. Forging a signature to seize financial assets you do not own across state lines constitutes a federal crime. I have forwarded this paperwork to the Federal Fraud Division for immediate review. David choked on his own breath. He slumped back into his leather chair, utterly defeated, his slick businessman facade melting away to reveal the desperate, bankrupt fraud he truly was. Chloe finally found her voice. Though it was nothing more than a hysterical, shrill screech, she lunged forward, her hand slamming violently onto the table. "This is a trick," she screamed, her perfectly manicured nails scraping the wood. "You are making this up. Eleanor, you manipulated Dad. Mom, tell her she is lying. Tell them this is a massive mistake. We deserve that money." But my mother, Margaret, said absolutely nothing. For the first time in her entire life, Margaret Wright was completely speechless. She stared at the authentic federal seals on the true trust documents and then looked at David's sweating, guilty face. The realization that her golden son-in-law was completely broke, and that her favored daughter was drowning in debt, crashed over her like a physical weight. The high society illusion she had prized above her own children was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I ignored Chloe's screaming. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a sealed, handwritten envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed, carrying the familiar scent of my father's aftershave and the faint metallic smell of his workshop. Dad did not pity me. "Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics with quiet, absolute authority. "He pitied you. He knew exactly what you and David were doing. And he left one final letter for the family to hear today." I broke the wax seal. The room dead silent again as I unfolded the heavy parchment. I read my father's words aloud, letting his deep wisdom fill the room one last time. "To my beautiful, brilliant daughter Eleanor." I read, my voice steady but thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me what true, uncompromising strength looks like. Thank you for having the courage to break the cycle of emotional abuse in this family. I leave the entirety of my estate to your federal trust, because you are the only person in this family who understands the actual value of truth." To Margaret and Chloe, I leave you exactly what you have always valued most: your appearances. You will find no money here to fund your illusions. Chloe collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. It was not a cry of grief for the father we had just buried. It was the desperate, ugly cry of a woman who had just lost her funding. My mother looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate panic. "Eleanor, please," my mother whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "We are family. You cannot just leave us like this. We did not know about David's debts. You have to help your sister." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The decades of guilt and obligation had completely evaporated. "For years, you judged a woman's worth by her blind compliance," I said, looking directly into my mother's eyes. "You thought my kindness was weakness. You thought my independence was a flaw because you could not control it. You spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and invisible so that Chloe could feel important." Stood up slowly, buttoning my army dress coat. I adjusted the star on my shoulder, feeling the weight of everything I had accomplished. "But women are not meant to be invisible. We are not meant to set ourselves on fire just to keep toxic people warm. I am proud of the woman I have become. I am walking away from you right now, not out of spite, and not out of anger. I am walking away because my peace is far too expensive for either of you to afford." I picked up my briefcase, took my husband's hand, and walked out of the lawyer's office without ever looking back. The aftermath of that afternoon in the lawyer's office was swift, brutal, and absolute. I did not have to engineer their downfall. I simply removed the financial safety net I had been holding under them for 20 years, and the gravity of their own terrible choices did the rest. 2 months after the funeral, the federal indictments came down exactly as Marcus had promised. David Sterling Sensei was formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and attempted forgery. The local news channels broadcasted the FBI raiding his sleek corporate office, carrying out boxes of hard evidence that proved he had been running a desperate financial shell game for years. He eventually took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial, but his financial ruin was entirely unavoidable, without my father's estate to save them. Chloe and David's superficial house of cards collapsed entirely. The bank formally foreclosed on their massive house in the gated community. Chloe was forced to sell her designer clothes, her luxury vehicles, and her exclusive country club membership just to pay for David's exorbitant defense attorneys. They moved into a cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, entirely alienated from the wealthy, superficial friends who dropped them the second the money dried up. My mother, Margaret, had to face the harsh, humiliating reality of the shallow life she had cultivated. The women at her social clubs stopped returning her calls. Embarrassed by the highly publicized scandal of her son-in-law, she tried to call me several times, leaving desperate, weeping voicemails begging for financial assistance and forgiveness. I never called her back. I simply forwarded her messages to my legal team and permanently changed my phone number. While their world fell apart piece by piece, my world remained exactly as I had painstakingly built it, peaceful, secure, and full of unconditional love. Marcus and I returned to our home, a beautiful property surrounded by ancient oak trees and quiet gardens. We spent our evenings cooking together, drinking wine on the patio, and talking about our futures. I continued my command in the military, leading my soldiers with the empathy and strength I had forged from the fires of my own difficult childhood. I did not feel guilty for my happiness. I did not feel a single shred of remorse for leaving my toxic family behind. I realized that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of psychological self-preservation. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to hear me clearly. Family is just a biological word, but behavior is an active, daily choice. You have the absolute, undeniable human right to demand respect in your life. Equality is not just a political concept we fight for in the workplace or the military. We must fiercely demand it at our own dinner tables. Do not ever let anyone tell you that setting strict boundaries is selfish. It is survival. If someone in your life is treating you like a lesser person because you do not fit their narrow, superficial definition of success, you must recognize the abuse for what it is. If they gaslight you, drain your finances, or intentionally make you feel small to inflate their own egos, you have every right to walk away. True love and genuine human compassion do not require you to constantly sacrifice your dignity. You do not owe your abusers your presence, your money, or your peace of mind. You are incredibly worthy of respect exactly as you are, and you possess the immense power to rewrite the narrative of your own life whenever you choose. Please take this as a serious warning. Emotional abuse within families is incredibly real, and it leaves deep, invisible scars that can dictate your choices for decades if left unhealed. If you are currently trapped in a situation where your mental health is being systematically destroyed by the very people who claim to love you, please seek professional help. Go to therapy. Talk to a counselor. Build a chosen family of friends who love you for your heart, not your wallet. I promise you that there is a beautiful, peaceful life waiting for you on the other side of your fear. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step toward the door. If my story resonated with you today, or if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member and reclaim your own power, please tell me your story in the comments below. You are not alone in this fight, and your voice truly matters. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with another strong woman who needs a desperate reminder of her own immeasurable worth. I read every single comment, and I will be right here waiting for you in the next video. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never apologize for your shine. Exactly 1 year had passed since the explosive confrontation in the mahogany-lined office of my father's attorney, and the changing of the seasons brought a crisp, biting chill to the autumn air. I was standing in the expansive backyard of the home Marcus and I had built together, watching the golden and crimson leaves fall gently from the ancient oak trees that lined our property. The world felt profoundly peaceful. The frantic, suffocating anxiety that used to plague my every waking moment during the years I was financing my toxic family had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, unshakable serenity. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my hands, feeling the comforting warmth seep into my skin as I watched Marcus chop firewood near the edge of the garden. He moved with a steady, rhythmic strength, his breath pluming in the cold air. We had spent the last 12 months cultivating a life that was entirely our own, free from the chaotic drama, the endless financial demands, and the cruel psychological manipulation that had defined my existence for 3 decades. I had successfully blocked my mother and sister on every conceivable digital platform, changed my phone numbers, and instructed the security personnel at my military base to turn them away if they ever attempted to show up unannounced. However, toxic people rarely accept the boundaries you set without attempting to test them one final time. As I stood on the patio, Marcus finished his task, gathered a heavy armful of split oak, and walked toward the house. He paused at the patio table, his expression shifting into a look of quiet concern. He nodded toward a small, crumpled envelope resting next to the morning newspaper. The mail had been delivered an hour earlier, and I had not yet sorted through it. The envelope was plain white, lacking a return address. But the handwriting sprawling across the front was immediately and painfully recognizable. It was Chloe's handwriting. The frantic, uneven loops of her cursive letters were a stark reminder of the chaotic energy she always brought into a room, even after a full year of absolute silence. Seeing her handwriting caused a brief, involuntary spike in my heart rate. A momentary echo of the conditioned trauma I had spent years in therapy trying to dismantle. Marcus set the firewood down carefully and stepped closer to me, his presence a solid, grounding anchor in the sudden wave of old memories. He did not tell me what to do. He simply stood beside me, offering his silent, unwavering support as I reached out and picked up the envelope. I opened the letter slowly, sliding a single sheet of lined paper from inside. The message was long, rambling, and drenched in the specific brand of manipulative victimhood that my sister had weaponized our entire lives. Chloe wrote about how incredibly difficult the past year had been for her, since David had been indicted, and their superficial high society life had completely collapsed. She detailed the miseries of her small apartment, the humiliation of losing her country club friends, and the sheer terror of facing bankruptcy. But what struck me most was the profound lack of genuine accountability. Nowhere, in the 2 pages of frantic scribbling, did she apologize for the decades of emotional abuse she had inflicted upon me. Nowhere did she take responsibility for attempting to forge our dead father's signature to steal his estate. Instead, she blamed David entirely, claiming she was merely a naive victim of his financial crimes. She then pivoted to weaponizing our mother's declining health, claiming that Margaret was incredibly depressed and that it was my absolute duty as the eldest daughter to step in, provide financial assistance, and repair the fractured family before the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. It was a classic psychological tactic known as hoovering, designed to suck a victim back into a cycle of abuse by playing on their deeply ingrained sense of guilt and familial obligation. I read the letter twice, analyzing it with the cold, detached precision of a military tactician examining an enemy's predictable battle plan. A decade ago, a letter like this would have completely destroyed my week. I would have felt a crushing, agonizing weight of guilt. I would have desperately rationalized their terrible behavior, convinced myself that I was being too harsh, and immediately reached for my checkbook to fix their self-inflicted catastrophes. I would have sacrificed my own peace of mind to temporarily soothe their endless dissatisfaction. But as I stood on my beautiful patio, surrounded by the life I had built through my own relentless hard work and the unwavering love of a good man, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure. The letter was not a genuine plea for reconciliation. It was merely a desperate demand for a renewed line of credit from a woman who still viewed me as an appliance rather than a human being. I handed the letter to Marcus. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening with silent anger, and then looked at me, waiting for my command. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the urge to draft a furious reply. Instead, I walked over to the stone fire pit, struck a single match, and dropped the burning paper into the dry logs. Marcus and I stood shoulder to shoulder in the crisp autumn air, watching the desperate, manipulative words of my abusers curl into black ash and disappear forever into the wind. The following spring, I found myself standing at the polished wooden podium of the United States Army War College, looking out over a sea of sharply dressed, deeply ambitious young military officers. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address for a leadership seminar focused on resilience, strategic decision-making, and the psychological burdens of high-level command. The auditorium was completely silent, filled with hundreds of men and women who were eager to learn how to navigate the incredibly complex, often terrifying responsibilities that came with wearing the uniform. As I looked out at their focused, determined faces, my eyes locked onto a young female captain sitting in the second row. Her name was Sarah Hayes. I had mentored Sarah a few times over the past year, and I knew that beneath her perfect military bearing and her impressive service record, she was carrying an agonizing personal burden. She was currently dealing with a highly toxic, financially parasitic family that constantly belittled her career choices while simultaneously demanding that she pay their mortgages. Looking at Sarah was like looking into a mirror reflecting my own painful past. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to say to her. And to every other person in that room who was silently drowning in the expectations of people who did not truly love them. Leadership, I began, my voice projecting clearly through the large auditorium, is not merely about understanding battlefield tactics, managing logistics, or giving orders to your subordinates. True, enduring leadership begins with the absolute mastery of yourself. It requires the courage to look at the landscape of your own life and identify the compromises you are making that are slowly destroying your integrity. I stepped out from behind the podium, removing the physical barrier between myself and the audience. Many of you in this room have been taught that loyalty is the highest possible virtue. You have been conditioned to believe that you must relentlessly sacrifice your own well-being, your financial security, and your mental health to protect the people around you. And while sacrifice is indeed a noble component of our profession, there is a profound, life-altering difference between sacrificing for a righteous cause and setting yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the silent crowd, making deliberate eye contact with Captain Hayes. Her posture had stiffened, and I could see the sudden glisten of unshed tears in her eyes as the message resonated deeply within her own private struggles. I spent 30 years of my life fighting a war on two entirely different fronts, I continued, my tone shifting into a deeply personal narrative. I wore this uniform and led soldiers in active combat zones, demanding excellence, establishing unbreakable boundaries, and holding my personnel to the highest possible standards of honor. But when I took the uniform off and went home, I allowed myself to be treated like an invisible, worthless asset by the people who shared my blood. I funded their extravagant mistakes. I absorbed their cruel insults. And I desperately shrunk my own presence in the world so they would not feel threatened by my success. I believed that my unconditional financial and emotional surrender would eventually earn their respect. But respect cannot be purchased. And it certainly cannot be earned by allowing yourself to be perpetually victimized. The day I truly became a general was not the day they pinned this silver star on my shoulder. The day I became a leader was the day I walked into a room, looked at the people who had abused my generosity for decades, and firmly, unapologetically closed the door on them forever. A collective breath seemed to escape the room. The young officers were hanging on every single word. You cannot be an effective leader of others if you are allowing yourself to be a hostage in your own personal life. I told them, my voice ringing with absolute conviction. You have an undeniable, fundamental human right to demand respect, not just from your colleagues, but from your families, your partners, and your friends. If someone is continuously draining your resources, attacking your self-worth, and demanding that you make yourself smaller to accommodate their massive insecurities, you owe them absolutely nothing. Do not let the biological accident of shared DNA convince you that you are permanently obligated to endure emotional abuse. Your true family consists of the people who celebrate your victories, who respect your boundaries, and who love you for your character rather than your compliance. Protect your peace with the exact same ferocity that you would use to protect your troops on a battlefield. Walk away from the people who refuse to see your immense value, and never, under any circumstances, apologize for the strength it takes to save your own life. As I finished speaking, the auditorium erupted into a massive, echoing standing ovation. And as I looked down, I saw Captain standing taller than ever before, her tears are finally falling, armed with the ultimate permission to finally set herself free. The arrival of the Thanksgiving holiday brought a profound sense of anticipation that I had never truly experienced during my childhood. For the first 30 years of my life, The fourth Thursday of November was not a day of gratitude. It was an exhausting, emotionally draining battlefield. I vividly remembered the endless holidays spent at my mother's meticulously decorated house, where the air was always thick with unspoken resentments and passive-aggressive cruelty. I used to spend hours cooking the expensive groceries I had purchased with my own military salary, only to sit silently at the edge of the table while Chloe bragged about her superficial country club life. My mother would inevitably make pointed, disparaging comments about my lack of a traditional family, intentionally attempting to make me feel small and inadequate. I had always swallowed my pride, paid the exorbitant credit card bills they inevitably handed me at the end of the evening, and driven back to my military base feeling utterly depleted. But this year, as the crisp autumn wind whipped the falling leaves against the large glass windows of our own home, the atmosphere could not have been more radically different. The house was filled with the rich, comforting aromas of roasted turkey, fresh rosemary, and wood smoke from the massive stone fireplace, creating a sanctuary of warmth and absolute safety. I stood in the center of our spacious kitchen, pouring a glass of red wine while Marcus expertly carved the roasted turkey. He wore a simple dark sweater and an apron, moving with a relaxed, effortless confidence that always made me smile. We were hosting our own Thanksgiving dinner, and the guest list was exclusively comprised of people who brought genuine joy, respect, and unconditional love into our lives. There were no blood relatives invited, and for the first time in my existence, the absence of my mother and sister did not induce a single ounce of guilt. Instead, I felt a deep, abiding sense of liberation. The doorbell rang, and the house quickly filled with the vibrant energy of our chosen family. My longtime friend and fellow military officer, Colonel Simone Ballard, arrived with her husband and their two young children, instantly filling the hallway with bright, infectious laughter. Shortly after, Captain Sarah Hayes walked through our front door, following my speech at the Army War College. Sarah had found the incredible courage to finally cut ties with her own financially abusive family. She looked fundamentally transformed. The heavy, suffocating weight that used to drag down her shoulders had completely vanished, replaced by a radiant, self-assured posture that proudly reflected the brilliant officer she was always meant to be. As we all gathered around the long, beautifully set wooden dining table, I took a moment to simply observe the room. The fire crackled brightly in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the faces of the people I loved most in the world. There was no tension. There were no cruel, underlying motives disguised as polite conversation. Nobody was secretly plotting to extract money from me, and nobody was waiting for an opportunity to humiliate me in front of an audience. It was just a group of intelligent, compassionate human beings sharing a meal and genuinely celebrating each other's presence. When all the wine glasses were filled, Marcus stood up at the head of the table. He did not ask for silence. The room naturally quieted down out of deep respect for the man he was. He looked down the length of the table, his eyes eventually locking onto mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "They say that family is the foundation upon which a person builds their life," Marcus began, his deep voice resonating warmly through the dining room. "But for a long time, the woman I love was forced to build her brilliant life on a foundation of emotional quicksand. Today, I am overwhelmingly thankful that we have learned the difference between the people who happen to share our blood and the people who actually share our values." Marcus raised his glass, offering a gentle, highly respectful nod to everyone sitting at the table. "To chosen family," he said clearly, "to the people who see us for exactly who we are, who respect the boundaries we set, and who love us fiercely without ever demanding that we shrink ourselves to fit into their insecurities." We all raised our glasses in unison, the crystal chiming beautifully in the warm room. As I took a sip of the rich red wine, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute victory. Chloe had once stood in a church and mocked me for being alone, assuming that my lack of a toxic biological support system equated to a life of pathetic isolation. Looking around my dining table, surrounded by brilliant military commanders, a fiercely protective federal prosecutor, and a deeply loyal circle of true friends. I realized just how incredibly wrong my sister had been. I was not alone, and I never would be again. I had simply stopped shopping for love at a store that only sold pain, and in doing so, I had finally allowed myself to be truly found. The deep winter months brought a quiet, highly reflective stillness to the world outside our windows. A heavy blanket of pristine white snow covered the sprawling lawn, absorbing the ambient noise of the surrounding neighborhood and leaving behind a profound, meditative silence. It was early Sunday morning. Exactly 2 years since my father had passed away, I sat alone in my private study, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, holding a warm mug of tea. On the heavy mahogany desk in front of me sat a small, battered metal coffee can. It was the only physical item I had personally retrieved from my father's workshop before the bank formally foreclosed on Margaret's house. Inside that incredibly simple, unassuming tin were the absolute most precious items I owned. The yellowed newspaper clippings of my military deployments, the printed programs from my various promotion ceremonies, and the handwritten notes my father had secretly kept for 3 decades. On the faded plastic lid, written in his blocky, precise handwriting, were the words, "My girl, the one who holds." I traced the faded black ink with my fingertips, feeling a deep, abiding connection to the only man in my biological family who had ever truly understood the immense strength it took to simply survive my mother's house. For many years, I had believed that true strength meant enduring the unendurable. I had convinced myself that absorbing the constant, vicious emotional blows of my mother and sister without complaining was a noble form of stoicism. I thought that by secretly paying their massive debts and acting as their invisible safety net, I was proving my intrinsic worth as a daughter and a human being. But looking back at the smoking ruins of their lives, and contrasting it with the immense peace of my own, I finally understood the fundamental truth that my father had been trying to teach me all along. Enduring abuse is not a measure of your strength. It is merely a measure of your pain tolerance. True, uncompromising strength is found in the terrifying, incredibly difficult moment when you finally look at your abusers, refuse to accept their toxic conditions, and choose to walk away. It is found in the radical, unapologetic belief that your mental health, your financial security, and your personal dignity are infinitely more important than maintaining a miserable, one-sided relationship with people who are absolutely committed to misunderstanding you. I carefully placed the plastic lid back onto the coffee can, feeling a profound sense of finality wash over me. The war was officially over. The heavy, invisible armor I had worn every single day of my childhood had been permanently removed, and I no longer flinched at the sound of a ringing telephone, dreading another manufactured crisis from Chloe. I had successfully broken the generational cycle of manipulation, guilt, and emotional extortion by fiercely protecting my own peace. I had inadvertently given dozens of other young women under my military command the explicit permission to do the exact same thing in their own lives. We had created a powerful, undeniable ripple effect of healing and self-respect that would echo far beyond the walls of my own home. I stood up, walked over to the large window, and watched as Marcus stepped out onto the snowy patio, tossing a handful of birdseed into the wooden feeder we had built together. He looked up at my window, smiled warmly, and offered a small, highly respectful salute before turning back towards the house. If you are listening to this story right now, I need you to internalize this message into the deepest core of your being. You are the sole author of your own existence, and you hold the absolute, unquestionable power to edit anyone out of your chapters who refuses to respect your narrative. The concept of basic human rights does not stop at the front door of your family home. You have the right to be treated with absolute dignity, the right to complete financial autonomy, and the right to exist in a space free from psychological torment. If someone continuously demands that you sacrifice your happiness to artificially inflate their ego, you must recognize that demand as an act of hostility. Never allow societal guilt or toxic family traditions to convince you that you deserve to be treated as a secondary character in your own life. You do not owe anybody an explanation for choosing your own mental survival. Be brave enough to set the boundary, be strong enough to enforce it, and be wise enough to know that the absolute best revenge against the people who tried to break you is to simply live a beautiful, highly successful, and incredibly peaceful life without them. Thank you for walking this deeply emotional journey with me. Please share this message with any woman who is currently fighting in the dark, and remind her that she possesses the immense, unbreakable power to turn on the light and finally walk out the door. The vibrant cherry blossoms of Washington, D.C. were in full, magnificent bloom, casting a soft, petal pink canopy over the historic streets of the nation's capital. It was early April, and the mild spring breeze carried a distinct sense of profound renewal and boundless possibility. I stood in front of the towering, floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master bedroom of the temporary housing Marcus and I had rented for the week. I was carefully adjusting the collar of my crisp, perfectly tailored army dress uniform. Today was not an ordinary day. It was the culmination of more than 2 decades of relentless dedication, strategic brilliance, and uncompromising personal sacrifice. In exactly 2 hours, I was scheduled to stand inside a highly secured, beautifully ornate auditorium at the Pentagon to officially receive my second Silver Star. I was being promoted to the prestigious rank of Major General, a milestone that only a fraction of military officers ever achieve, and one that required absolute excellence in every single aspect of command. As I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I did not see the terrified, desperately eager to please young woman who used to eagerly empty her bank accounts just to buy a fleeting moment of approval from a deeply toxic mother. I saw a formidable, highly respected leader who had successfully conquered her own internal demons before ever stepping onto a literal battlefield. However, trauma has a peculiar way of attempting to resurface right at the precipice of your greatest victories. As I reached up to secure the brass buttons on my coat, a sudden fleeting whisper of self-doubt briefly echoed in the back of my mind. It was the insidious, deeply ingrained voice of my mother, Margaret, a phantom echo from the past attempting to undermine my confidence. The ghost of her voice whispered that I was simply an imposter, that I was taking my career too seriously, and that I was inherently lovable because I had chosen professional ambition over submitting to her manipulative control. For a fraction of a second, my hands actually trembled. The old familiar anxiety threatened to tighten my chest. But then, the heavy bedroom door creaked open, and Marcus stepped into the room, entirely shattering the negative illusion. He was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, radiating the quiet, immense power and absolute stability that had always anchored me. He walked up behind me, meeting my gaze in the mirror, and gently placed his large, warm hands on my shoulders. He did not ask if I was nervous. He simply looked at the woman he loved with a level of profound, unconditional pride that completely eradicated the lingering ghost of my mother's toxic criticisms. "You earned every single millimeter of this," Marcus said, his deep, resonant voice echoing with absolute certainty. "You built this empire with your own hands, Eleanor. Nobody handed this to you, and absolutely nobody has the power to take it away. You are the most brilliant, capable woman I have ever known, and today, the entire world is finally going to officially recognize what I have always seen." I leaned back against his solid frame, taking a deep, cleansing breath, and physically felt the residual anxiety completely evaporate from my body. He was entirely right. I had survived the treacherous emotional landmines of my childhood. I had navigated the immensely complex political landscape of the military, and I had successfully built a life that was entirely bulletproof. When we finally arrived at the Pentagon, the auditorium was packed with hundreds of distinguished guests, including high-ranking government officials, decorated combat veterans, and the loyal, deeply trusted friends who comprised my chosen family. Colonel Simone Ballard was sitting in the front row, beaming with immense pride. Captain Sarah Hayes was there as well, looking fiercely inspired. When the Chief of Staff formally read my citation, detailing my strategic command decisions, my unwavering commitment to my troops, and my flawless record of ethical leadership, the entire room erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. As my commanding officer officially pinned the second silver star onto my uniform, I looked directly out into the crowd and locked eyes with Marcus. He was standing tall, clapping fiercely, completely comfortable allowing his wife to stand squarely in the center of the brilliant spotlight. There was no jealousy, no fragile male ego, and absolutely no hidden agenda. It was a partnership of absolute, undeniable equality. In that triumphant, overwhelming moment, I realized that the true victory was not just the prestigious promotion or the shiny star on my shoulder. The ultimate victory was the profound, unshakable peace I felt within my own soul. I had successfully rewritten the entire narrative of my existence, permanently closing the heavy book on the generational trauma that had tried to destroy me, and opening a brand new volume where I was the undisputed, victorious author of my own beautiful destiny. 5 incredibly peaceful, highly productive years had passed since my promotion to Major General, and the frantic, high-stakes rhythm of my active-duty military career had finally transitioned into a deeply rewarding, thoroughly earned retirement. I was now 52 years old, and as I sat on the wraparound porch of the expansive, custom-built home Marcus and I had designed in the quiet countryside, I felt a profound sense of absolute completion. The sun was slowly setting over the distant, rolling hills, painting the expansive evening sky in breathtaking shades of deep violet, burnt orange, and soft gold. A gentle, warm breeze rustled through the massive oak trees, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of the surrounding pine forest. I had a thick, woven blanket draped comfortably over my lap, a steaming cup of chamomile tea resting on the wooden table beside me, and a large, incredibly loyal golden retriever sleeping peacefully at my feet. The absolute, defining characteristic of my life now was silence. It was not the tense, suffocating, weaponized silence that used to follow a massive argument with my sister, Chloe. It was a rich, beautiful, healing silence. It was the sound of a nervous system that had finally, permanently downregulated, completely free from the exhausting hypervigilance that comes from surviving chronic emotional abuse. I had not heard a single word from my mother or my sister in over 6 years. Occasionally, through the distant, convoluted grapevine of old hometown acquaintances, small pieces of information would inevitably filter through. I heard that David had ultimately served his time in a federal minimum security facility and that he and Chloe had finalized a very bitter, highly contested divorce shortly after his release. I heard that Margaret was living in a small, assisted living apartment, constantly complaining to anyone who would listen about how her incredibly selfish, ungrateful eldest daughter had cruelly abandoned her. Hearing these distant, tragic updates no longer elicited any emotional response from me whatsoever. There was absolutely no lingering guilt, no twisted sense of obligation, and certainly no desire to swoop in and rescue them from the highly predictable consequences of their own toxic actions. I had finally accepted the fundamental, unalterable truth that you simply cannot save people who are absolutely committed to destroying themselves. My only responsibility in this world was to protect my own peace, nurture my loving marriage, and continue pouring my hard-earned wisdom into the younger generation of women who desperately needed guidance. Over the past few years, I had dedicated a significant portion of my retirement to establishing a private, highly specialized mentorship foundation designed exclusively to support female military officers and ambitious women in high-stress federal careers. I traveled across the country, delivering keynote speeches, facilitating intensive leadership workshops, and providing the exact type of fiercely protective, highly empathetic guidance that I had desperately needed when I was a young, terrified lieutenant. I taught these brilliant women how to effectively negotiate their salaries, how to strategically navigate male-dominated environments, and most importantly, how to ruthlessly identify and eliminate the toxic, parasitic relationships in their personal lives that were secretly draining their potential. I taught them that setting an uncompromising boundary is the highest form of self-love, and that walking away from emotional abuse is an act of profound bravery, not a shameful failure. Watching these incredible women completely transform, watching them shed their deeply ingrained societal guilt and step confidently into their immense power, was infinitely more rewarding than any medal or commendation the military had ever given me. As the final, lingering rays of the golden sunset slowly faded into a deep, starry twilight, Marcus stepped out onto the porch. Carrying 2 glasses of our favorite vintage red wine, he handed me a glass, pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the top of my head, and sat down in the wooden rocking chair right beside me. We sat together in the beautiful, comforting silence, watching the fireflies slowly begin to illuminate the dark edges of the sprawling garden. If you have listened to my story all the way to this final chapter, I want to leave you with one absolute, undeniable truth to carry in your heart forever. You are infinitely worthy of a life that feels peaceful, secure, and deeply respected. You do not have to earn your right to exist by endlessly serving people who refuse to acknowledge your humanity. If you are currently standing in the dark, absolutely terrified of the massive fallout that might happen if you finally say the word no, I promise you that the temporary explosion is entirely worth the lifetime of peace that follows. Put down the heavy burden you were never actually meant to carry. Step confidently into the brilliant light of your own immense potential. Protect your heart, fiercely defend your boundaries, and never, under any circumstances, allow anyone to make you feel small ever again. The absolute best chapters of your life are still waiting to be written, and you hold the only pen. As we reach the end of Eleanor's journey, the deepest lesson here isn't just about the satisfaction of a shocking reveal or watching toxic people face the consequences of their own actions. The true heart of this story is about the terrifying, yet deeply liberating act of reclaiming your own worth. For decades, Eleanor falsely believed that by making herself smaller, hiding her incredible success, and financially saving her abusers, she could eventually buy their love and respect. But emotional abuse does not disappear when you feed it, it only grows hungrier. Society often conditions women, especially daughters and older sisters, to be the perpetual peacekeepers. We are repeatedly told that family is everything, even when that specific fix is actively destroying our mental health and draining our resources. Eleanor's story teaches us a crucial, life-altering lesson. Shared blood does not equal a lifelong debt of your sanity. You have an absolute, undeniable human right to establish firm boundaries. Walking away from people who consistently gaslight you, diminish your achievements, and use you as emotional or financial safety net is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of psychological survival. When Eleanor finally stopped funding her own abuse, she didn't have to actively seek revenge. The cold, hard truth did all the work for her. The fake empire her family had built simply collapsed under its own weight. And in the peaceful space left behind by her toxic relatives, she was able to fully embrace her chosen family, a true sanctuary of unconditional love, mutual respect, and absolute equality with a partner who amplified her strength instead of being threatened by it. If you are currently trapped in a cycle of family toxicity, let this story be your wake-up call. You do not owe anyone a performance that keeps them comfortable at the expense of your own peace. Be brave enough to step into your power. Firmly close the door on those who drag you down, and never, ever apologize for the incredible, peaceful life you build without them. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team to bring you meaningful value and life lessons.